You really think that orange thing can hit 4,000 meters? The laugh rolled across the firing range before the question had even finished leaving Corporal Ethan Briggs's mouth. A handful of young Marines joined in immediately, their voices carrying over the dry afternoon wind sweeping across Camp Redstone. The target zone stretched across miles of desert terrain, shimmering beneath waves of heat. Range flags snapped sharply against their poles. Dust curled across the ground in thin spirals. And standing quietly behind the firing line was an old man who looked completely out of place. Dean Walker was 81 years old. His faded denim jacket hung loosely from his shoulders. His white hair moved gently in the breeze. Deep lines crossed his face like old maps carved by decades of sun, weather, and time. Yet his pale blue eyes never seemed old. They remained fixed on the distant ridges beyond the range, as if they were studying something nobody else could see. In his hands rested the source of the Marines' amusement. The rifle was unlike anything they expected. Its stock carried a faded orange finish worn smooth by age and countless years of use. The color looked almost ridiculous beside the sleek black precision rifles lined neatly across the firing positions. To the young Marines, it looked more like something hanging on the wall of a hunting cabin than a serious long-range weapon. Gunnery Sergeant Ryan Mercer folded his arms and shook his head. "Sir, with all due respect, that thing belongs in a museum." More laughter followed. One Marine pulled out his phone. Another nudged his friend and pointed toward the old rifle. Dean said nothing. He simply continued looking downrange. The silence seemed to irritate Mercer more than any argument could have. The gunnery sergeant stepped closer. "We've got ballistic computers, weather stations, laser range finders, and the best optics money can buy. You're telling me that old rifle can do something these can't?" Dean finally lowered his gaze toward the younger man. His expression remained calm, untroubled. "No," he said quietly. "I'm saying the shooter can." The laughter stopped for only a moment before returning even louder. Briggs nearly doubled over. "That's the best thing I've heard all week." Around them, Marines continued preparing for the day's qualification exercise. Spotters adjusted scopes. Wind meters beeped softly. Vehicles moved in the distance. Helicopter rotors hummed somewhere beyond the ridgeline. The entire range carried the organized energy of modern military precision. Yet Dean appeared disconnected from all of it. His attention remained focused on the horizon, on the invisible movement of air, on details nobody else seemed to notice. A younger lance corporal named Jacob Ross stood several yards away watching the exchange. Unlike the others, he wasn't laughing. Something felt wrong. The old man's posture, the way he carried the rifle, the complete absence of defensiveness. Ross had grown up around veterans. His grandfather had served overseas decades earlier. He recognized something familiar in Dean's stillness. Real confidence rarely needed to announce itself. Mercer pointed toward the distant desert. "Tell you what, Mr. Walker, there's a steel target out there just under 2,500 yards. Nobody's hit it all week. If that orange rifle can even ring steel once, I'll personally buy you dinner." Dean looked down at the weathered rifle in his hands. His fingers brushed across the faded orange stock. The movement was small, almost unnoticeable, but the instant his hand touched the worn surface, something shifted behind his eyes. A memory stirred, an old memory, older than many of the Marines standing around him. The desert wind seemed to disappear. The laughter faded, and for the briefest moment, Dean Walker was no longer standing on a modern Marine Corps range. Dean Walker adjusted the orange rifle carefully, his hands steady despite their age, fingers tracing the familiar contours worn smooth by decades of practice. The young Marines leaned forward, curious and skeptical, their polished gear gleaming in the mid-morning sun. Dust swirled around the range as a light breeze cut across the desert, carrying the faint scent of heated sand and the distant hum of helicopter rotors. Dean squinted along the scope, noting the slight shimmer of heat over the distant ridges, the faint movement of the flags snapping at irregular intervals. Every detail mattered. The desert was alive with invisible currents. Corporal Ethan Briggs shifted uneasily beside Sergeant Ryan Mercer, who frowned, arms crossed, sensing the shift in energy around the old man. The laughter that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by a taut silence, the kind that made every creak of equipment and whisper of wind feel amplified. Dean inhaled slowly, allowing the calm of decades to settle over him. His mind wandered briefly, recalling another time and place, a narrow canyon somewhere overseas where every calculation, every adjustment mattered. Fingers found familiar grooves in the rifle, recalling how even a slight misalignment could mean the difference between success and failure. He exhaled gently, and the world of the modern range seemed to blur. Lance Corporal Jacob Ross watched in quiet fascination, noticing the way Dean's eyes measured angles, distance, and wind, processing variables that no digital readout could capture. Mercer muttered something under his breath, a hint of unease in his voice. Dean's gaze remained unwavering. He aligned the rifle, adjusted the elevation dial, and centered his aim on a tiny steel target perched nearly 2.5 miles away. The range flags waved violently in the heat haze, but Dean's focus was absolute, his hands absorbing the rhythm of the environment. Every young Marine present felt the tension coil tighter around them, an unspoken acknowledgement that they were witnessing something remarkable. Dean tapped the stock lightly, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and memories of past operations surfaced, not as triumphs, but as lessons etched deeply into his awareness. The wind whispered secrets that only someone with decades of experience could read. The distant desert air shimmered, carrying the weight of anticipation. Mercer stepped slightly forward, almost instinctively, sensing the moment reaching a peak. Dean inhaled again, the steadying breath of someone who had faced countless impossible scenarios. The old rifle, orange and seemingly out of place, became an extension of his perception, every inch calibrated to the environment. Ross could see the intensity in Dean's eyes, a calm fire that defied age. The other Marines stiffened, feeling the unspoken command of presence and mastery. Dean exhaled one final time, aligning himself perfectly with the target, the sun glinting off the scope as he readied for the shot. The hum of distant vehicles, the snapping flags, and the lights scattering through the heat waves created a symphony of anticipation. Nothing moved but Dean, his body a study in stillness and precision. Mercer, Briggs, and the others instinctively leaned in, all eyes on the old man who refused to speak but conveyed authority with absolute certainty. Every detail mattered, every fraction of a degree and subtle current of wind accounted for. The desert seemed to pause, holding its breath with them, waiting for the moment that would prove what had always been true. Skill is timeless, and respect is earned through quiet mastery. Dean Walker exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the desert heat settle on his shoulders, and yet his movements remained deliberate, controlled, precise. He adjusted the cheek rest on the orange rifle just slightly, aligning it perfectly with the subtle undulations in the distant landscape. The mirage dancing over the horizon could have fooled anyone else, but not him. Every ripple of heat and wavering of the flags was accounted for. Lance Corporal Jacob Ross, standing a few yards away, could not take his eyes off Dean. The young Marine had spent years studying marksmanship in simulators and with the latest optical equipment, yet nothing he had learned approached this level of observation and understanding. Sergeant Ryan Mercer shifted his weight nervously, sensing the change in the air, the tension that seemed to emanate from Dean without a word spoken. Dust from the range swirled up gently in the light breeze, wrapping the firing line in a haze that distorted depth and perspective, yet Dean's gaze remained unwavering, unblinking. He traced the line of sight with a careful hand, adjusting for wind, distance, and even the faintest shift in the sunlight that might affect visibility. His mind moved through calculations with decades of instinct honed over countless days of practice, each variable folding into the next seamlessly. Dean's eyes flicked once to the steel target far beyond the 2,500-yard mark, the faint shimmer of sunlight on its surface like a pinprick of gold against the tan desert. He remembered other ranges, other conditions, but most vividly, he remembered moments when precision had been everything, when a single miscalculation could have denied a mission or delayed a critical moment, and now all of that knowledge resided in the calm stillness of his body and the subtle grip on the rifle. The young Marines sensed it, a ripple moving through them, the quiet recognition that this man was no ordinary veteran. Mercer took a careful step back, his voice catching for the first time in the morning as he muttered under his breath about the improbability of the upcoming shot. Ross's fingers twitched lightly on the scope of his spotting device, measuring angles, distances, and atmospheric conditions, yet nothing seemed adequate to explain the aura of confidence emanating from Dean. The rifle rested lightly against his shoulder, but it felt almost like an extension of him, a channel through which experience, focus, and intuition flowed without effort. He exhaled again, the movement deliberate, precise, as if synchronizing breath and body to the rhythm of the desert itself. The sun hung high, casting elongated shadows across the sand, and the heat waves rippled visibly, bending the light and challenging perception. Dean blinked once, just enough to reset focus, and then he surveyed the target line again. Every movement of the flags, every subtle change in air pressure, every minute detail was accounted for. Mercer and Briggs exchanged a glance, unspoken acknowledgement of the extraordinary calm and precision displayed before them. The silence stretched, thick and expectant, broken only by the distant hum of vehicles moving along a service road and the soft creak of flagpoles swaying in the wind. Ross took a shallow breath and felt his heart rate climb slightly, a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. Dean Walker did not speak. He never needed to. The stillness, the methodical adjustments, the absolute control over every factor in the environment communicated everything without a single word. Every young Marine on the line could feel it, the invisible authority of a life spent mastering the impossible, and with it came a profound respect, quiet and unspoken, that settled over the group like the shifting desert air itself. The moment was taut with anticipation, and the world seemed to pause, holding its breath along with Dean Walker, waiting for the first sound that would prove mastery, patience, and skill are timeless. The shot broke the silence with a crisp report that rolled across the desert and vanished into the vast open distance. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Every eye followed a path that could not be seen, tracing an invisible line through layers of shimmering heat and shifting air. Dean Walker remained perfectly still behind the rifle. His finger eased away. His breathing never changed. The old Marine looked less like a man who had just taken an impossible shot, and more like someone who had completed a routine task he had performed thousands of times before. Several seconds passed, then more. The steel target sat so far away that even the most advanced optics on the range struggled to resolve it clearly. Lance Corporal Jacob Ross pressed his eye harder against the spotting scope. The image wavered through heat distortion. He adjusted focus once, twice. His pulse quickened. Then he saw it. The target was moving. Not much, just enough. A faint sway that should not have existed. Ross blinked. He checked again. The movement remained. His mouth opened slightly. "No way," he whispered. Beside him, Sergeant Ryan Mercer grabbed another spotting scope and quickly aligned it downrange. The confident expression he had worn all morning disappeared almost immediately. His jaw tightened. A long silence settled over the firing line. Even Corporal Ethan Briggs stopped smirking. The distant steel plate continued its subtle movement beneath the desert sun. Nobody laughed now. Nobody made jokes about old rifles or outdated skills. Dean slowly stood upright and rested the rifle against the bench. The orange stock glowed softly beneath the afternoon light. It looked exactly the same as it had 30 minutes earlier. Old, worn, ordinary. Yet the atmosphere around it had completely changed. Ross lowered the spotting scope. His hands felt strangely unsteady. "Sir," he said quietly toward Mercer, "I think you should see this." Mercer did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed downrange. Finally he exhaled. "I already did." A faint electronic chirp suddenly interrupted the silence. Then another. Several Marines looked toward a nearby operations vehicle parked along the edge of the range. Inside, a technician glanced down at a monitoring screen and frowned. Another alert appeared. Then another. The technician reached for his headset. Something unusual was happening. Long-range tracking systems operating throughout the training sector had registered the shot. The data did not make sense. Automated software immediately flagged the event for review. A trajectory that should not have existed was now appearing on military systems across the installation. The technician stared at the screen. He entered the numbers again. The answer remained unchanged. His eyebrows lifted. "You have got to be kidding me." He grabbed a radio. Across the firing line, Dean appeared completely unaware of the growing commotion. He simply removed a soft cloth from his pocket and began cleaning the rifle with patient care, the same way he had done countless times before. Ross watched him carefully. There was no pride, no celebration, no attempt to draw attention, just quiet discipline, the kind built over a lifetime. The wind shifted slightly. Dust drifted across the range. In the distance, another operations vehicle accelerated down a service road. Moments later, inside a command building several miles away, an unusual alert appeared on a senior officer's screen. The officer frowned and opened the report. Within seconds, his expression changed completely. General Carter's boots clicked sharply across the polished floor as he approached the observation deck overlooking the range. Inside the command building, screens flickered with the trajectory of the shot, each display confirming what should have been impossible. The general's face was a mixture of disbelief and disciplined awe. Around him, aides whispered hurriedly, eyes darting between screens, radios, and tablets as the unusual data continued to populate the system. Dean Walker remained behind the firing line, carefully setting the orange rifle down on the bench and retrieving a small cloth to wipe the stock, his movements calm, measured, and without any rush. The young Marine stood frozen, still staring downrange, the magnitude of what had just occurred settling over them with a weight that made conversation impossible. Even Mercer, whose voice had carried authority for hours, found himself without words. The desert seemed to hold its breath with them, heat waves rising and falling, air quivering as if in anticipation of something else to come. Ross raised his hand slowly, pointing toward the far horizon. "Sir, the telemetry," he said softly. "The data shows a perfect alignment, all variables accounted for. This is historic." Mercer turned, finally registering the calm precision with which Dean had handled the rifle, and a faint nod acknowledged the skill before him. Dean's expression never changed. He had done this countless times in his past, each instance a lesson in patience, observation, and mastery. Yet today it felt different, amplified by the awareness of those watching, those who doubted. The soft hum of distant vehicles blended with the sharp snap of the flags, the only audible signs of life in a moment stretched taut with reverence. Then, at the far edge of the range, a convoy of black sedans appeared, rolling quickly along the service road. Ross squinted, recognizing the unmistakable insignia of a senior officer's motorcade. The general had arrived. Mercer instinctively stepped forward, hand at his side, posture rigid. Dean did not move. He simply returned the cloth to his pocket, eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting the general, yet untouched by the formality or fanfare. The sedans came to a halt, and General Carter stepped out, his tall frame casting a shadow over the desert floor. He paused, taking in the scene. The young Marines frozen in disbelief, the faint spiral of dust in the air, and Dean, standing calm, rifle at rest. Carter's eyes narrowed, then widened subtly, recognition settling across his face as he understood the quiet authority present in this single figure. He took a slow step forward, each motion deliberate, mirroring the controlled precision he had seen in military exercises thousands of miles away. And yet nothing in his long career had prepared him for this level of mastery executed with such understated calm. The young Marines instinctively straightened, standing at attention, even though no order had been given. Every detail in the environment, the swaying flags, the shimmering heat, the faint hum of distant activity, seemed to acknowledge the arrival of authority meeting experience. Dean Walker tilted his head slightly, offering nothing more than a measured gaze. The general approached, silent for several steps, eyes fixed on the old man who had just demonstrated what decades of experience could achieve. No words were spoken, only the recognition of competence, earned and unquestionable, flowed between them. Mercer, Ross, and Briggs all held their positions, the atmosphere thick with respect, anticipation, and the shared understanding that they had just witnessed something that would be remembered for a lifetime. Dean's presence, calm and unassuming, contrasted starkly with the ripple of alertness spreading through the range and the command building. He was the quiet epicenter of extraordinary skill, and General Carter's nod, subtle yet heavy with acknowledgement, confirmed what the entire group already knew. Mastery does not shout. It waits, it observes, and it acts with precision that defies expectation. General Carter stopped a few feet from Dean Walker, and for several long seconds neither man spoke. The wind moved between them, carrying grains of desert dust across the firing line. Around them, dozens of Marines stood perfectly still, uncertain whether they were witnessing a routine inspection or something far more significant. Carter's eyes drifted toward the orange rifle resting quietly on the bench. Then back to Dean. A faint smile appeared at the corner of the general's mouth. "I was wondering if I would ever see that rifle again," he said softly. The words landed like a shockwave. Mercer looked from Dean to the general, confusion written plainly across his face. Ross felt his stomach tighten. The general knew him, not as a visitor, not as a retired shooter. Personally, Dean studied Carter for a moment before giving a small nod. "You have more gray hair than last time." A few Marines exchanged stunned glances. Nobody joked. Nobody moved. General Carter let out a quiet laugh. "That tends to happen after 30 years. The atmosphere shifted again. Respect had already replaced skepticism, but now curiosity took its place. Mercer finally cleared his throat. "Sir, if I may ask, how do you know Mr. Walker?" Carter looked toward the distant horizon where the target sat nearly invisible beneath the heat haze. His expression grew thoughtful. "When I was a young lieutenant," he said, "I spent 6 weeks trying to understand long-range observation and environmental reading. Every instructor gave me formulas. Every manual gave me procedures. None of it worked until someone handed me over to him." The general gestured toward Dean. Complete silence followed. Ross stared at the old veteran. Briggs felt his face grow warm as memories of his earlier jokes replayed in his mind. Carter continued. "He taught me something no computer could teach. He taught me that the environment is always speaking. Most people simply do not know how to listen." Dean looked away as if the conversation had nothing to do with him. The reaction only deepened the respect forming among the Marines. Real legends, Ross realized, never seemed interested in talking about themselves. An operations officer hurried toward the group carrying a tablet. He stopped beside the general and handed it over. Carter glanced at the screen. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Interesting." Mercer shifted nervously. "Sir." Carter turned the tablet so several Marines could see. Telemetry reports filled the display. Tracking systems from multiple sectors had independently verified the shot. Every reading matched. Every calculation aligned. There was no error, no malfunction, no anomaly, only confirmation. Ross stared at the numbers. They seemed unreal. Briggs swallowed hard. The range that morning had been filled with advanced optics, software, and predictive systems. Yet the most impressive performance had come from a quiet man carrying a rifle older than many of the Marines present. Carter handed the tablet back and looked directly at Dean. "There is someone else who needs to hear about this." Dean sighed softly. "I was hoping you would not say that." Carter smiled. "Unfortunately for you, sir, the commander of this installation already received the alert." Dean shook his head slightly. The gesture was small, but Ross noticed it immediately. It was not fear. It was the expression of a man who knew attention was coming and wanted no part of it. In the distance, another convoy appeared on the service road, moving quickly toward the range. The young Marines followed it with their eyes. Something told them the day was only beginning. The second convoy arrived faster than the first. Dust billowed behind the dark vehicles as they crossed the service road and rolled toward the firing line. Every Marine present could feel the shift in atmosphere. What had started as a routine training day had become something entirely different. Doors opened almost simultaneously. Senior officers stepped out first, followed by command staff carrying tablets and folders. Their expressions were serious, focused, and unusually tense. Lance Corporal Jacob Ross watched as several of them moved directly toward General Carter without even glancing at the range. Quiet conversations followed. Heads nodded. Screens were exchanged. Data was reviewed again. Whatever they were discussing seemed important enough to command the attention of everyone present. Dean Walker remained exactly where he was. The orange rifle rested on the bench beside him. His hands were folded casually in front of him. He looked more interested in the distant mountains than the growing crowd gathering around him. Sergeant Ryan Mercer noticed it immediately. Most people would have been nervous under that kind of attention. Most people would have tried explaining themselves or seeking recognition. Dean did neither. He simply waited. A colonel approached General Carter carrying a tablet. "Sir, we verified everything 3 separate times," he said quietly. The telemetry is accurate. Every tracking system reached the same conclusion. Carter nodded once. I expected that. The colonel glanced toward Dean. Then it really is him. Ross caught the exchange and felt curiosity tighten inside his chest. Him. Not a shooter. Not a visitor. Him. As though everyone already knew something he did not. Mercer felt it too. Briggs shifted uneasily beside him. The young Marines had stopped viewing Dean as an old veteran hours ago. Now they were trying to understand who he actually was. The colonel turned toward Dean and slowly walked forward. Several officers followed. The firing line fell completely silent. Even the wind seemed quieter. The colonel stopped a few feet away and extended his hand. Mr. Walker. Dean looked at the hand for a moment before shaking it politely. Colonel. The officer smiled. Sir, I have wanted to meet you for 20 years. The statement stunned the Marines. Dean looked mildly confused. Why? A few officers exchanged amused looks. The colonel shook his head. Because half the advanced observation doctrine we teach today originated from reports attached to your field notes. Ross blinked. Mercer stared. Briggs looked as though someone had removed the ground beneath him. Dean sighed softly. Those notes were never meant to become doctrine. Maybe not, Carter replied from behind the group. But they did. A faint smile crossed the general's face. The desert sunlight reflected from the windows of the parked vehicles. Heat shimmered above the range. Somewhere overhead, a helicopter passed beyond the clouds, its distant rotor hum blending into the background. Yet nobody looked away from Dean Walker. For the first time all day, Ross began understanding why the senior officers seemed so focused. This was not about a single shot. The shot had only revealed something much larger. Years of quiet service. Years of knowledge passed forward without recognition. Years of influence hidden behind humility. Dean glanced toward the mountains again. His expression remained unchanged. But Ross noticed something. The old veteran seemed slightly uncomfortable. Not because of authority. Not because of pressure. Because attention itself appeared foreign to him. And that realization earned even more respect from the Marines standing nearby. The convoy engines cooled. Radios crackled softly. Officers continued arriving. The crowd around Dean slowly grew larger. Yet the old man remained exactly the same. Calm. Quiet. Unmoved. And somewhere inside the command building, another message had already been sent to someone even higher in the chain of command. The message that had moved up the chain of command finally reached its destination less than 20 minutes later. Nobody on the range knew exactly who had received it, but they felt the effect almost immediately. Radios became busier. Vehicles appeared from roads that were normally empty. Officers who rarely left headquarters suddenly arrived in person. The entire installation seemed to be quietly reorganizing itself around a single event. Dean Walker noticed all of it and appeared completely unimpressed. He sat on a folding chair near the firing line, the orange rifle resting across his knees while the desert wind tugged gently at his jacket. General Carter stood nearby speaking with senior staff, but every few moments his eyes drifted back toward Dean, as if making sure he was still there. Lance Corporal Jacob Ross found himself unable to leave. Training schedules had been forgotten. Qualification exercises had stopped. Even Sergeant Ryan Mercer remained close, watching events unfold with growing disbelief. Earlier that morning, he had viewed Dean as an old visitor carrying outdated equipment. Now he was trying to reconcile that image with the reality standing before him. A black helicopter appeared on the horizon. Its distant rotor hum rolled across the desert like approaching thunder. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The aircraft descended toward a nearby landing zone reserved for distinguished visitors and senior leadership. Dust spiraled upward beneath the rotor wash. Ross exchanged a glance with Briggs. Neither man said a word. They already knew this was no ordinary arrival. Several colonels immediately moved toward the landing area. General Carter followed a few moments later. Dean remained seated. He looked toward the helicopter once, then returned his attention to the mountains beyond the range. The reaction confused Ross more than anything else. Most people would have been curious. Most people would have stood. Dean did neither. The helicopter touched down smoothly. A small group emerged and began walking toward the range. Their pace was calm but purposeful. As they approached, every officer present straightened instinctively. Some stood at attention without being instructed. The atmosphere shifted once again. Ross felt it immediately. This was authority at a level he had rarely witnessed. The group reached the firing line. The senior figure at its center was an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. He exchanged a brief greeting with General Carter before his attention settled entirely on Dean Walker. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then something unexpected happened. The senior officer smiled. Not a formal smile. Not a political smile. The genuine smile of someone seeing an old friend after many years. Dean slowly stood. A similar expression appeared on his face. Around them, confusion spread through the younger Marines. Nobody understood what they were seeing. The senior officer approached and stopped directly in front of Dean. The wind fluttered the edges of their uniforms. Dust drifted lazily across the ground. Then the officer extended his hand. "You disappeared again," he said. Dean chuckled softly. "I was trying to." A ripple of laughter moved through several senior officers nearby. Ross blinked. Mercer looked completely stunned. General Carter folded his arms and smiled knowingly. The senior officer glanced toward the orange rifle resting on the chair. "Still carrying that thing?" Dean followed his gaze. "Still works." The answer earned another smile. Then the officer turned toward the assembled Marines. His expression grew serious. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "you may not realize it yet, but you spent this morning standing beside one of the most influential field instructors this service has ever produced." Complete silence followed. No one laughed. No one moved. The desert itself seemed to stand still as the full weight of those words settled across the range. The silence lingered long after the senior officer finished speaking. No one rushed to fill it. The words carried too much weight. Across the firing line, young Marines stood motionless beneath the afternoon sun, their earlier confidence replaced by something far more valuable: understanding. Lance Corporal Jacob Ross looked toward Dean Walker and realized that every assumption he had made that morning had been wrong. The old man had never argued, never defended himself, never corrected anyone. He had simply allowed the truth to arrive on its own. General Carter stepped forward and glanced at the orange rifle resting quietly on the folding chair. "Do you know how many people still study your reports?" he asked. Dean shook his head. "No." Carter smiled. "Thousands." A faint breeze crossed the range. The distant mountains glowed beneath the late afternoon light. The shadows had begun to stretch across the desert floor, painting long dark lines between the vehicles and equipment scattered throughout the training grounds. The senior officer nodded toward the rifle. Most of them probably expected a legend to look different. A few officers chuckled softly. Dean looked down at the worn stock and ran a hand across the faded finish. That is usually the problem with expectations. Even General Carter laughed at that. Nearby, Sergeant Ryan Mercer finally stepped forward. The confidence that had defined him earlier was gone. In its place stood humility. He stopped in front of Dean and straightened his posture. "Sir," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Dean looked at him for a moment. "For what?" Mercer seemed surprised by the question. "For assuming I knew who you were." Dean nodded slowly. "You did know who I was." Mercer frowned. Dean's eyes drifted toward the horizon. "I was exactly what you saw. An old man carrying an old rifle." The answer settled over the group like the evening wind. Ross understood immediately. The lesson had never been about reputation. It had never been about rank, records, or recognition. It was about character, about patience, about mastery that existed whether anyone noticed it or not. The senior officer checked his watch and reluctantly sighed. The day was moving on. Meetings waited. Schedules demanded attention. But nobody seemed eager to leave. Finally, Dean lifted the rifle and slipped it into its case. The movement felt symbolic somehow. The extraordinary moment was ending. The old veteran looked toward the gathering of Marines one final time. "Keep studying the wind," he said. "It tells the truth more often than people do." Then he turned and began walking toward the parking area. No speech, no ceremony, no celebration. Just quiet footsteps crunching across desert gravel. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then General Carter raised his hand in salute. The senior officer beside him did the same. One by one, officers followed. Then the Marines. Ross stood at attention as Dean Walker continued walking without looking back. The setting sun painted the desert gold. The wind moved across the range. The orange rifle disappeared into the distance. And long after the vehicles had left and the range had returned to normal, The young Marines remembered what they had witnessed that day. Not the impossible shot, not the alerts, not even the arrival of generals. What stayed with them was something far simpler. Real mastery does not demand attention. Real respect does not ask to be recognized. And some of the greatest people in the world walk quietly among us, carrying nothing more than experience, humility, and a story they never feel the need to tell. Some legends are not remembered because they seek recognition. They are remembered because their actions continue speaking long after they have fallen silent.